Pik përkrahet nga Prishtina Ticket.
Mirë, e vazhdojmë sonte me Vesna Pusic, ish ministre e jashtme e Kroacisë, ish zavendës kryeministre e Kroacisë, sociologe, aktiviste drejtave të njeriut, aktiviste, njëra prej themeluesve të organizatës së parë feministe në ish Jugosllavi. Vesna, welcome.
Thank you.
I have introduced you with many of the titles, but one of them is that you were one of the founders of the first feminist movement in socialist Yugoslavia at the time, which was not very common in the socialist world.
That is true. That was a long time ago. That was in the second half of the 70s. At that time, when we were thinking about it and talking about it, we didn't know what we were doing exactly, and also didn't know that would provoke such a reaction.
Yeah.
Not to say backlash or attack. Because socialist Yugoslavia had, in many ways, quite enlightened laws and legislation.
But this would be a parallel organization. This would be
First of all, you had relatively enlightened laws. You didn't have such enlightened practices in real life. And secondly, we didn't have a word for NGOs. We didn't know how to call this. And and certainly not for different political parties. It was a one-party state. And it was a reaction after a big international feminist conference, or women, it was called Comrade Woman.
Okay.
That was organized in Belgrade by some friends of mine at that time. And we realized when we came that everybody who was anybody in feminist movement at that time
in the world.
Came.
Yeah.
In the world
Yeah.
came. It was really impressive. And when we came there, we realized that there was a group of us. We weren't working together before that, but there was a group of us from Zagreb, all of us approximately the same age, so in our mid to late 20s, or some early 30s maybe. All of us somehow emerging in the public sphere, either mainly through writing, either journalism or academic writing, or that kind of forming a public persona. The very beginning, let's say, of a public persona for all of us. And we started, the conference lasted for almost a week. And one thing I remember illustrates very well how things developed was that at the beginning, we would all start our interventions saying, although I'm not the feminist, I think that, and then whatever you wanted to say.
Now, I mentioned this fact because it has led on two paths. The first one is you were engaged at the time, even earlier, in a movement of intellectual debate in ex-Yugoslavia about freedoms and about freedom of expression and all the personal freedoms that one should have had. And that led to a concept of how democracy should look like, thinking about democracy, which eventually came, the end of the Berlin Wall. You were part of that movement that saw the end of the Berlin Wall, and then were ready actually for
action.
Let's say. And the second was you were, as a feminist, well, not as a feminist, you were...
No, as a feminist. I will finish this,
but
you
were as a very successful Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia and a negotiator for the integration of Croatia into the European Union. You were nominated for Secretary General of the UN, which you would have been the first woman Secretary General of the UN. Now we have another one coming, hopefully, Michelle Bachelet from Chile. So I mentioned these two because we live in a totally different world from the one you started conceptualizing as a democracy.
That is true, absolutely. But some things sort of persist, or there is a line connecting all of that.
Okay.
To finish my first sentence, we would start by saying, although I'm not a feminist at the beginning of the week, at the end of that week, we would start our interventions by saying, I, as a feminist, want to say, etc., etc. So there was, obviously we were ready, but we didn't quite know what it was. And in particularly, we were not, this was, as I said, the 70s in a one-party system. We were all born in that country, so intellectually we knew other things, but didn't have personal experience of other things. So this type of activism that would include actually an organization with membership rather than a state agency, because at that time in Yugoslavia we had a state agency for women, but it wasn't a movement or an organization that had members.
It was a gongo.
Government, but exactly. But even that didn't have members, just administrators. And so we came back to Zagreb and started this organization. We sat in the kitchen of our friend Rade Vekovic and decided that now we were going to start acting collectively and form this feminist group in Zagreb, not dreaming that it would provoke such attacks the moment we made it public. And not only from the authorities, but also from some supposedly very progressive male journalists who were outraged that what is this, and this is not serious, and absolutely outraged. That was very, very interesting, resulting in the fact that 7 of us, within 2 months, had over 1,000 members because people joined us. And since we didn't have a word for NGO, let alone, which means we didn't have the concept, we didn't know what to do. And as the members, as people wanted to join, to participate in our public activities and discussions, it was more sort of an intellectual, not the pro action, let's say, group at the beginning. We were getting in more and more danger because the authorities started thinking, what is this? What are these girls doing here? And our professor, Rodi Supek again, since a number of us were sociologists by training, came to our rescue. He was at that time the president of the Croatian Sociological Association that worked in chapters. It had a chapter for, let's say, urban sociology, chapter for organizational sociology. So he said, one solution is you become a chapter of the Sociological Association. And we did. We were called Women in Society. And for a while, it was rock and roll. It was really an exciting experience because people joined. We had very lively discussions. And I would say, it sounds like prehistory, but the thing that sort of connects and runs through all of these experiences from that experience to this day is owning your ideas, that your ideas are something that you will stand up and defend, and owing the public sphere that you actually have the right to be present in the public sphere, that this is not something that's reserved or should be controlled in some ways in which some people can, some cannot. So this, I think, is a prerequisite for a free mind in a free society.
Which is clashing with, I mean, we had a period of time in which that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the years building a democratic society was actually a collective production of ideas, if one could, and of values at the same time. Now we have a period in which the notion of our ideas or values are constrained by two forces, historical forces, that have different motives and come from different places. One is the end of the unipolar world that is being demonstrated by President Trump in defining his perspective of the world from a vision of a Make America Great Again. And the other is President Putin's war against Ukraine that has created new conditions that are not linked neither to Yalta nor to the OSCE or what was it called at the time, the CSCE concept of Europe. So the frame in which we developed our ideas in Europe and our values is being endangered seriously.
I would say that our role has changed dramatically more than anything else because of these changes.
And when we say we Europeans.
Yeah. When I say we, I mean we Europeans.
Yeah.
We're talking in Europe. We are, I think, all belong into this European Union. However, it develops over time, and it will. But because, first of all, I think that Putin's project is also make Russia great again. His idea is of the imperial Russia, not even the Soviet Russia, but imperial Russia, and is probably more connected with territorial expansion, which I don't think you have in the United States, although there were, of course. But I'm not taking that seriously. There were this comments about Canada becoming the 51st state.
And Greenland.
And Greenland is a different story. Greenland is losing the European allies forever. But that is, there are aspirations, or at least comments. But I would say in the case of Trump, it's more really changing the political system in America and American role globally. And in the case of Putin, it's actually even more than in the American case, make Russia great again, literally.
Yeah.
Let's
take the first one. Mm-hmm. Let's take the first one. You say change of the political system of America, which is happening, but the role of the U.S. is not linked only to the change of the political system of America. It was President Bush, President Obama, who actually said, we're not interested in Europe anymore. We want to move our axis, focus on China.
Asia, China.
And so it is a historical change irrelevant of who sits in the White House.
I would say that maybe the focus of the relationship goes across political divides in America, but the basic alliance, this transatlantic alliance, has experienced a dramatic change under Trump administration. Maybe Obama and Bush and Biden were not that focused on Europe, but they were not giving up the transatlantic alliance, NATO, seeing and treating Europe as allies, and providing this historically present security shield that America and NATO provided for Europe, to such an extent that this European Commission that took office in December of 2024 is the first commission in Europe's history to have a commissioner for defense.
Which means for the first time we are thinking about how to defend the continent.
Thinking. Or it means that until this recently, we weren't even thinking that we would ever, as Europeans, need to defend ourselves from anybody. But if I can go a little bit back and say that during the wars of former Yugoslavia, the Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo wars, all started by Slobodan Milosevic, which were horrible in all possible ways. And it was obviously awful to live through that. But I always thought, okay, we are now going through these horrible times. But this is like, the last breath of an old regime, of times and ways of dealing with things in politics and in international relations that is passing. So we are witnessing the last breath of a dying politics. Today, it looks like this was the first sign of things to come globally. And this is what's so worrying, let's say.
From populism to...
From populism to this division of spheres of interest.
Yeah.
Because you can have global division of spheres of interest, but you can also have the micro division.
Yeah.
Because saying, Milosevic saying, this is my interest, so I will wage war for that. What happened, in some ways, I would say that we living in the Balkans or in Southeastern Europe, in this part of Europe, have maybe more experience and can better understand what's happening than Western Europeans or especially Americans themselves. I think the way Trump administration, especially the second Trump administration, managed to put under control all the checks and balances and institutions of the American state shows the ease with which that happened, shows to what extent Americans are not prepared to understand the consequences of this kind of new world order. And this new world order, as we all know, is not that new. It's just new in comparison with the world order, which was based on international law, on certain international multilateral organizations, everything not perfect, everything not completely equal for everybody. But if anything, we are now witnessing the difference between an imperfect world order and no world order whatsoever, and chaos. And this is what we are facing now to some extent. This is why I say we are maybe in this part of Europe better equipped to understand what's happening.
Although one of the people you mentioned in your analysis, Alexander Stubb, he doesn't speak of the end of the order as such, but of the order that has not reached yet its end. It has still surviving in one shape or form. The question is this a process, a rift, or is it something that is reversible?
I don't think it's reversible.
So we are speaking of U.S. out of the collective defense of...
We are speaking of basically no world order based on international law, where international law is not being respected or even taken into account. We are speaking of weakened multilateral organizations, especially the UN, which you mentioned earlier, and I think we should return to that topic. We are speaking of the breakup of the old alliances, in particular the alliance between the United States and European Union.
Which for people in Kosovo is existential, and for not only people in Kosovo, but the region.
We are speaking also of the new personal alliance between the American president and the Russian president. So I don't think that the countries are allies, but the presidents are allies. So personally, they probably have the best relationship of any two leaders in the world. I mean, of bigger countries, not only of the big powers. This all is new. Of this extreme, as they politely call it, extreme transactionalism that American administration is working under. All of that is changing things forever, in my opinion. They're not going to go back to what they were, but they are going to produce something new that's going to be better from this kind of extreme transactionalism, misogyny, racism, which has resurged in international politics as values.
Legitimization of genocide, and genocide has become more or less.
This is more extreme.
Yeah.
But I have been looking into this because when things are, everybody was quoting Gramsci for a while, saying, it's the time of monsters, when the old order is disappearing and the new order has not emerged yet.
And it's not quite the quote, actually.
Of course. But it fits somehow. It fits. In particular, I would say that it fits something that we have never witnessed before, and that is global fear. Fear has always been a very potent instrument of politics, as we know.
Well, one of them is fear from the unknown, evidently.
Fear from the unknown. Fear from losing predictability of alliances. Sure. Fear of political whims of the big leaders. This is all justified fear.
Sure.
I mean, we should be afraid because
yes, we wake up in the morning
and there is a war, and that reflects itself. You can say, okay, that's a war far away. For us here, it's not far away, but for some countries. But this is going to reflect itself. In the price of bread and milk tomorrow in your local store, everywhere on the planet. It is also going to encourage ruffians and this profile of narcissistic political leadership that includes cruelty. Locally, I mean, you don't need the big powers here to make your life miserable. You can have a regional autocrat that can create pretty much the chaos. And for us, it's almost irrelevant whether it's a big power or a regional autocrat who is creating conflict, chaos. And they definitely are all encouraged by this. Now, the question is how, and this was my sort of obsession and is my obsession at the moment, to try to figure out, to find elements, not of how to go back, because I don't think we're going back, because once it has been demonstrated that you cannot rely on a relationship, you're never going to forget that. I mean, even if people change, leaders change, presidents change, you know now that this is possible.
Yes, trust is tradition.
And it's built over a long period of time, and it's destroyed in one day. Yeah. So, and especially now, very many days. but to find signs of building blocks of a new world order. Because a world in chaos and the world that depends on the whims of the few leaders, 1, 2, 3 leaders of big nations, of big countries, rich and geographically big and militarily dangerous, and they're now all militarily dangerous, probably China the least, but militarily dangerous, is a world that cannot function, that doesn't function. I mean, I always say, in the UN that has 193 members, about 18 countries are classified as large, world powers or large countries, which means that 175 are the rest. Yeah. So
90%.
We are the rest, and we have to figure out a world in which certain rules exist, because for medium-sized and small countries, it's impossible to survive without some rules that everybody will observe. And so I have followed what's being said internationally and have, for now, selected 3 leaders that have come up with some new ideas. One is Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
In his famous speech in Davos.
And in his speeches, other speeches that followed, but he started with his speech in Davos at the beginning of this year. Then the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, who wrote a book called The Triangular Power, Ili Powers, and who is actually in close communication with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who I know because we were foreign ministers together. He was earlier foreign minister of Finland. And Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, who has come up with, first of all, his opposition to American President Trump, and his approach and demands, but then has recently had a programmatic speech at a Chinese university that he gave at a Chinese university. And I've tried from their ideas to piece together some of the building blocks. This is not a finished idea, finished vision of what should we build and where are we going.
Okay.
But these are building blocks that can be used in order to understand better what we need to at least take into account and where do we start from. And I take out a few elements from their speeches and ideas. Carney saying this is a rupture, not a gradual process, meaning you have to react immediately. It's not something that gives you time to work through it.
Or to come back.
Yeah. Saying also we need a global alliance of middle powers, which then makes a number of countries way more interesting, and also if they're aligned and somehow coordinate, make them way more influential, of course, economically, financially, militarily, in every possible way. And thirdly, saying we can build partial alliances. In other words, we can build alliances with countries that we don't agree on everything, but we agree on, let's say, a few points, and on these points we can cooperate.
Although he also mentions the crisis of capitalism as something that has to be dealt with.
You will see in everything that they said that the old Milton Friedman chant, markets will take care of everything, is out the window, because, I mean, we've known that for a long time, but this hasn't been so obvious and so visibly articulated and felt, because all of these three people who are politically, Stubb is at least, I mean, he's not a reactionary, but he is politically belongs to the conservatives, to the People's Parties of Europe. Mark Carney is liberal, and Pedro Sanchez is a social democrat. But all three of them speak of the need to reduce economic differences within societies and among societies, globally, among countries. So Stubb goes into this direction, saying we are dealing with three situations almost in parallel: competition, conflict, cooperation. And we have to manage all these three situations simultaneously. They're not following each other, but they're, with some countries we're in competition, with some countries we are in conflict, with some countries we are cooperating, and we are also trying to change this conflict into cooperation, not to invoke one of the greatest American presidents, Abraham Lincoln, who said, I've defeated all my enemies, I've turned them into my friends. And then there is Sanchez.
Yeah.
And Sanchez has, again, this same idea that you have to somehow take into account this, that you have to work with countries that you don't agree with 100%.
Starting with China and understanding that the old maps of the Mediterranean,
that was very
which was the
interesting.
beginning of his speech, that
yes.
the map does not reflect the reality.
The reality, that is true. That is a very, very nice sort of vignette to start his speech. But saying, standing up in the middle of China and saying, guys, we have to reduce trade deficits among countries. And China, as the biggest country with the biggest trade sufficit with everybody on the planet, it's a brave thing to say that, but it is true. And he calls this horizontal economies, saying we have to reduce trade deficit in order to reduce the extreme differences. There will, of course, always be differences. This is referring to what you reminded me of, the need of the criticism of the way capitalism works today. We need to reduce the extreme differences among different countries because it actually creates conflict. These huge differences in wealth, in living standards. And one way of doing that, making the first step, is reducing the trade deficit among countries. He's also speaking of multilateralism and the need to deepen multilateralism in order to make it, to help it survive, because it's certainly...
Well, all three of them recognize that we have switched from unipolarity to multipolarity. And the question is now not whether we will live in multipolarity, but how actually to create a sense out of multipolarity. And,
absolutely.
And how to, in both Stubb and Sanchez, speak of enhanced multilateralism with the global South inside.
Absolutely. That is, I think, where to some extent the future lies.
Yeah.
And well, people like you who know what is called global South much better and have known it throughout your life probably understood that way back then.
Yeah.
But now it seems that most people are starting to understand that global South, the so-called global South, is not only something that deserves patronizing attention, but actually the power of the future.
Yeah, it's not Tito's non-aligned movement.
No.
Well,
I was a big fan of the non-aligned movement because I think it was politically a great idea in the 50s.
Yeah.
But not, time passes. But one thing that I also wanted to mention, which I think is relevant, that they also raise this issue of how can I say, sort of a kind of global public good. That there is such a thing as global responsibility for global public good. And global public good is, for instance, consequences of the climate change, defense, security, all of these things. The internet.
Sanchez.
Yeah, this is Sanchez. Reducing inequality. All of these things that actually you cannot contain within one country, that affects everybody, and that in that sense, everybody or all the middle powers and the big powers have to take responsibility for this global, I would say, civic good or global good. And this is also maybe a very good basis for new basis or new forms of cooperation, because you can politically disagree with somebody, but you still have the floods, the extreme weather, all of these things that affect these countries regardless of what kind of political system and values you have.
There are two discrepancies in the rhythms of what we are talking about. The first discrepancy is the power of the decision that the United States has. So let's say the US decides tomorrow to close European bases. That will not allow the Europeans to actually start a thinking process of what do we do about it. You have to make decisions, and quick decisions. Because one of the issues that emerges is we have instinctive reactions in Europe. For example, having the Commissioner for Defense, for example, spending more money on defense, both from the European Union and from member states. But the decisions that are made and the thinking that is being made about the global good needs institutions, needs institutional changes, both at the global level and most importantly at the European level. Now, one of the issues that emerges is how can Europe make decisions tomorrow? If the US president decides to close a base tomorrow, how does the European Union make a decision about it tomorrow?
I think
Is it capable?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm 100% certain, because I don't see that Europe has for some time thought that America or NATO is the guarantee of its security. But it's buying time. It's buying time until it puts in place an alternative security alliance. And I would say that, closing a American military base, I don't think that even today it would affect Europe as much as it would have affected it, let's say, a year ago or a
What
few
happens
years ago.
if President Trump wakes up in the morning and says, bond steel, I don't need it anymore in Kosovo?
Europeans would need to come in.
Yes, but that's needs is a different thing. Would
Well,
the
Europeans
come?
have started this coalition of the willing.
Yeah.
It was started under the pretext, and included the United States, under the pretext of an alliance to defend Ukraine and support Ukraine, which Trump obviously doesn't care about. Actually, in my opinion, nucleus of a future security alliance, which will not include the United States, but will include Canada, will include probably Australia, maybe even Japan, although Japan has a special constitution that prevents certain type of military cooperation.
Turkey?
Definitely UK, and definitely Turkey. I think for Europe, Turkey is an important middle power right in the neighborhood. And I'm absolutely certain that this is part of this. Turkey is part of the alliance.
So we're speaking of a European security space.
Absolutely. I think Europe is aware of that. Europe is aware of that, especially in relation to Ukraine. And also something has happened within the European Union, because for a long time, and on some administrative levels, it's still there, but not on the political level. The notion that, in issues related to defense, there is a European leadership being formed that includes the UK, although UK is not a member of the European Union, but has developed much closer ties with the European Union, but certainly France and Germany. Also, both Ukraine and Trump administration, so Russia's war on Ukraine and Trump administration, has increased homogeneity within Europe. For instance, you see the same reaction from Pedro Sanchez, who is a social democrat from Spain, and Giorgia Meloni, who is not conservative, but reactionary, you can say, although she, in power, I think she's been much more pragmatic than anybody expected, but certainly right-wing and left-wing European leaders who are reacting the same way to Trump. And both Italy and Spain have something to think about when we are speaking of basis. But the approach of the Trump administration has unified these two sides of the spectrum. And I think that in that sense, you have to start thinking, and we have to start pushing, and there is space for small members like Croatia, as well as obviously for the big European countries, to start pushing towards taking this coalition of the willing one step further into an actual defense alliance, European defense alliance.
Parallel to NATO?
Absolutely parallel to NATO. Absolutely.
So it's not a European NATO.
Well, it's NATO in the sense that it has Canada. So this is transatlantic, but not with the Americans. And you've seen the last meeting of the consultation that was held in Paris over the securing Strait of Hormuz in the future after the war, which included 40 countries without the Americans, precisely because you cannot rely on and predict what's going to happen there and how this is going. So everybody is very polite still in Europe to some extent. But after Greenland, and especially now after the attack on Iran, I think that European leaders have absolutely understood that Europe has to have its own defense. By the way, Europe spends, I think, slightly more than China on defense, or at least that China did before Trump came in. But the coordination is horrible. I mean, they produce, tanks that are not compatible, 17 different types of tanks that are not compatible within Europe. So it needs more money, but it has actually secured more money. Now it needs more coordination, and as Sanchez would say, deeper multilateral integration in defense.
If one were to be a devil's advocate on this, would say, how can Europe assume responsibilities in foreign policy and defense if it was unable to deal with issues such as Kosovo, Serbia for so long, or Bosnia and Herzegovina for so long? How are these unfinished conflicts going to be marked down if European Union wants to assume global ambitions?
It was, I would say, in a very different time when Europe was not able And I would say, actually, that probably a more precise definition was not willing, not interested in resolving and getting involved in the sort of finalizing these project of, as you called them at the beginning, unfinished states and also unresolved conflicts. It really felt extremely comfortable. And also for a while, I mean, European project was an extremely exciting project when it was started in the 40s and 50s. Then it became almost invisible. Nobody was talking about it until the changes in Eastern Europe. And then it became again a big, enthusiastic project.
There were several restaurants in Kosovo, Europe 92.
Then it became, I mean, I personally thought that we could have caught, Croatia could have caught that first train in 2004 when the first East European countries joined European Union. Unfortunately, we didn't because, of course, of our own slowness. But we eventually joined at the tail end. And hopefully we'll write something about it under the title The Last Chance Café to describe that experience of sort of entering European Union at the tail end of this enthusiasm.
Yeah, otherwise you would be stuck with the rest.
And we wouldn't be any better. Because there's no reason to be any better if you're stuck in a certain situation. So, as I said, there was great enthusiasm at one point. Then it was almost invisible in the 70s. Who cared about the European Union? And nobody discussed it. Nobody talked about it. Then came the late 80s and the 90s when this was, again, reunification of Europe and democracy all over Europe, fantastic things. Then there was enthusiasm of the first East Europeans entering the European Union. And then again, it started gradually dying down, this enthusiasm from enlargement. And then came a series of crises, with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, with then the enlargement fatigue, reflection period, failing of the referenda in France and Netherlands, actually in Netherlands and then in France, about the European Constitution, which would have meant a higher level of European integration. So everybody pulled back. And then came the populists. The populists, Marine Le Pen and people like that, have been around in Europe for a long time. So then came the populists who were deconstructing Europe until Brexit. Brexit was a serious setback, a huge setback for the United Kingdom, but a serious setback for Europe. But when everybody else saw what was happening to the UK after it left the European Union, the issue of deconstructing or leaving Europe was completely off the agenda. Then came this idea of capturing Europe, of the populist movements with then eventually help of the Trump administration taking over Europe. So we are not leaving, but the Orbáns and the Alternative für Deutschland and the Le Pens are going to take over Europe. And then now we have this situation where Trump's support contributed greatly to Orbán's downfall. And all these populists are now distancing themselves from the current American administration. So we have nothing to do with this guy after seeing what happened to Hungary. And I would say that Europe was too self-satisfied with itself, with the living standards that were improving, with its own situation, to take up conflicting and potentially disrupting situations like our region and the unfinished states and frozen conflicts that we have here. Because I think, and from my time in the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union, I remember that everybody thought, yeah, but those are small countries, it will somehow solve itself. Yeah. And also there were Americans. So they always thought Americans are going to do something. Now everybody knows that it's better that Americans don't do anything, because if they do, it's going to be potentially damaging.
Well, it's the fourth year of the war in Ukraine, but nothing has significantly changed in the approach, with the exception of speeding up the integration of Montenegro due to the geopolitical decision on Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova.
That formation of the coalition of the willing, increasing...
No, I mean on the region. On policies of the region.
On the policies for the region. Yeah. The policies for the region towards the region have changed only in the sense that everybody now is talking about the integration of the region into the European Union. But, of course, everybody has now bigger and better things to worry about, which is psychologically, and in every other way, but also psychologically, it's immeasurably more difficult for the Europeans to get used to the fact that the American administration is not our allies than it was to get used to the fact that we are losing the Russian gas and oil. And that although everybody thought, Russia has such a strong grip on Europe through energy sector, this took less than a year to sort of restructure itself. But this losing the Americans as a reliable ally is way, way more difficult. And European leaders didn't start to speak out about it until Trump started talking about taking over Greenland. And for the region, I go back now to where we started. If anything, these adversities that we are facing can be used for a positive thing. One positive thing for the region is that this attitude in the European Union has changed in the sense that everybody now thinks the region somehow, sooner or later, needs to get integrated into the European Union, if for no other reason, for the security and stability reasons. The other thing is, we started talking of these new ideas and building blocks for the new world order. And one of the things is this idea of cooperation on things that you can cooperate on, rather than emphasizing complete agreement or emphasizing the differences and where we disagree. And the other is this notion of responsibility for the collective good or global good. Now, you have global good, of course, but you also have regional good. I have personal experience again when there were floods in Croatia in 2014, and I applied for some money from the European Union to deal with some of the immediate consequences of the flood, which had to do with, there were a lot of dead animals in these flooded areas along the Sava River. And one thing they told me, the first reaction was, sure, but this is just for Croatia, not for non-members. And I said, this is very nice. But 2 non-members border with us. This river is a border.
That does not stop.
Between Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia and Serbia. And we cannot, for instance, kill mosquitoes that could potentially spread diseases in just half the river.
Yeah.
This is a small example. And in the end, this was granted, and we could use it for the whole river. But this is a small example of how certain things require cooperation and require responsibility, regardless. Of course, you have to have minimally rational leaderships. Because, of course, you in politics, we have also seen people who would say, it's better that we don't get it as long as we can prevent the neighbor from getting something. So there is this type of madness in politics we have also seen. But if you have minimum rationality, there are certain forms of responsibility, civic global responsibility that connects us because we sit in the same part of Europe. So I think we could regionally use these building blocks. Why am I saying that? I think that we can, by taking also Croatia, Slovenia, maybe Austria, maybe Hungary under the new management, so to speak, under Peter Magyar, we could take as part of the region and start thinking ourselves of how to finish the European project in Southeastern Europe. I think that, and I've always been very prone to trying to adhere to the sentence, nobody can help you if you cannot help yourself.
Well, as we are approaching the end of this very nice conversation, let's get from where we started, and that is, in this tumultuous world, a person that you know much better than I do, but we know together, Michelle Bachelet, may be a candidate for the Secretary General for the United Nations and maybe the next Secretary General. What would that be?
That would be a miracle. That would be a wonderful thing. First of all, Michelle Bachelet is a person with enormous political experience, with an incredible and sometimes pretty horrific personal life experience, since her father was murdered by the Pinochet regime in Chile. Since she was a refugee for many years that couldn't return to Chile, since then she was the president of Chile twice. And by Chile's constitution, it cannot be consecutive, so she genuinely won elections twice with somebody else in between being president. She was also the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. And from my experience, I can't say I know her very well, but I spent some time, different occasions, having very interesting talks and discussions with her. She's genuinely a good person, and I think that actually is important, as we see in international relations today.
And somebody who speaks straight.
She speaks straight, and the fact that she is a woman, and I think this is something that the United Nations, it's almost a survival strategy for the United Nations, not because it would be a change to everything we have seen so far, and it would be also sticking to something that was discussed in the United Nations for some time. And when I was candidate in 2015-16, they were all saying, it's got to be a woman from Eastern Europe. And they elected a man from Western Europe. But of course, it's not any woman. It has to be, because you have women also who are who I wouldn't vote for anything in the world because you disagree with their politics, you disagree with their values and
capacity, etc.
Capacities and everything. But Bachelet is a woman with obvious capacity to do this, proven and demonstrated, but also with this type of life experience, which brings with it a way bigger reluctance to conflict, to war, a way bigger concern with the so-called politics of everyday life, meaning that, it's not irrelevant whether we will have here a few thousand dead people. You can't prevent it. This is something that I think we have to start thinking about, and this is, I think, something that Michelle Bachelet and a woman of that profile, values, and capacities brings itself and would bring herself to the role of the Secretary General. Also, she has been through a long career. So I think she's not a person that will, not say what she thinks because she's thinking of the next job that she might be a candidate for. She's not going to be a candidate for any job after that, after being Secretary General of the United Nations. That also gives her a sort of freedom and independence that's needed in this job, and I really, really seriously hope that she gets it, not so much for her sake, I must say. I don't know what to wish her personally, but for our sake, for everybody else's sake.
Vesna Pusic, it was a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pik për krahet nga Prishtina Ticket.